Hello friends, I can save you a little bit of money. This video is about the comparison between the cameras between the original Mavic and the Mavic 2 Pro. Let's get started. Hello friends, welcome back to my channel. It's been a long time since I've been on the camera. Work has just really kept me busy and all, and not too much time for RC flying. But I wanted to get to this video because I feel it's important and it could benefit some of you out there. So I'm a professional photographer, and when I got my first drone, the DJI Phantom 3 Pro in 2015, I took my photography to a new height, and it was just amazing what I could see and photograph, shoot photos and video, and I just was hooked from the start. 2 years later, I got the DJI Mavic Pro, the original one, and was just amazed at the quality, the steady shots I can get from the drone. And then 2 years later, I got my DJI Mavic 2 Pro. I started flying it on August 1st this year, and was amazed right off the bat with the quality of the camera. I mean, the 1-inch CMOS sensor compared to the original DJI Mavic Pro was a big difference, and I can definitely see it right off the bat. So what I want to kind of do as a photographer, when I get something new, I want to kind of do some tests and figure out the pros and cons of it, and what is the best settings for that particular lens or camera or whatever it may be. So I'm going to share those with you. Hope you can understand. Leave comments if you have questions about what I discussed. So I thought my first test would be to hover both the Mavic original and the Mavic 2 Pro and take pictures side by side to compare the difference. Well, you can see the error in that. I was too scared that they would actually crash, and there was a slight parallax error between the two different camera shots. So the first thing we need to discuss is the sensor size. The original Mavic has a 2/3 size sensor, and the new Pro has a 1-inch size sensor. You can see the size difference. So that means you're going to get more pixels in the same image. The other thing to note, which may not be as apparent, is the aspect ratio of the sensors. The original Mavic has a 4:3 aspect ratio, which is like the old analog TV. Who has those anymore? The new Mavic 2 Pro has a 3:2 ratio, which is more like my digital SLR. So edge to edge, they are slightly different. Alright, this is my setup. So on the right I have the original Mavic, and on the left I have the Mavic 2 Pro. So the controller for the Mavic 2, I'm using my phone. And for the original controller, I'm using the DJI Crystal Sky monitor. So I've gone through and got the settings identical to each other. Same white balance, same image size, same style, which is none. Color is normal. And on the Mavic 2, the one big difference is I now have an aperture. So I can go from 2.8 up to 11, and we're going to get into that later on, what that means as a photographer. So you don't have that option with the original DJI Mavic. You just have ISO and shutter. You can't control the aperture, and that's why you have to use the neutral density filters. Okay, so one of the things I wanted to test is in the morning, there's very little wind, so I didn't want to have the trees being shaking. So I've got the ISO set at 100 and shutter speed of 1/60th of a second, but according to the histogram, it looks a little underexposed. I don't want to get the shutter speed too slow, because then you do have motion blur just from the shake of the table or the Mavic or the wind or something like that. So what I'm actually going to do is increase the ISO to 200 to get a little better setting. So the Mavic 2 is on 2.8 aperture. The original one is on a fixed 2.2 aperture, so I can't change that. And just for verification, I'm going to tap on the distance, take a photo, tap on the distance, take a photo. So that way, make sure that they're both focused on the same point. Let's tap it on the near, take a photo, tap on the near, take a photo. So this video is taking a lot longer than I expected, and it's very lengthy in the final product. So for those of you that want me to cut to the chase, here are my findings. If you want to get your best, sharpest focus on the new Mavic 2 Pro, I recommend you set your aperture to f4 or f4.5. I found out that at f2.8, things aren't as sharp from front to back or from near to far. If you go all the way up to f11, then actually things become a little bit softer. So my recommendation is to keep your aperture at f4 or f4.5. Therefore, if you're shooting video, in order to keep that aperture at f4, your shutter speed at 1/60th, that is providing you're shooting at 30 frames per second video, then you're going to need some neutral density filters. I actually use the Freewell variable neutral density filters, and I love them a lot. If you're shooting photos, you don't necessarily need to have a neutral density filter, because then you can have your shutter speed to be as fast as it needs to be in order to get your image or your shot. Now back to the full length of the description of how I did my tests. Alright, so now I'm in Photoshop, and I've pulled up the 4 images you just saw me take. And what I wanted to show you is an overview, seeing all the image pixels. On the right is the original Mavic Pro, and you can see that it has more of a squarish aspect ratio of 4,000 by 3,000 pixels. I tried to line up the left side or the right side of the image to be the shutter of my garage, and the left side to be my neighbor's house. So you saw me tap to focus down the street for far image focus on both the Mavic 2 and the original Mavic. So let's go ahead and look at those 2 images by themselves. If I hit zoom and take this to 100%, right now you can see that the left side, which is the Mavic 2, is a little more zoomed in. That's because I'm seeing more pixels on the image resolution than I am on the original Mavic. So at this point, if I were to move it around, and I can actually hold shift and the space bar, and it moves both the images at the same time, viewing at 100%, it looks like this sign is fairly close to be really sharp. Over here on the Mavic 2, it's not as sharp. You also notice the difference in the greens. So the Mavic 2 has a new Hasselblad image sensor, and then the greens are represented a little differently than the original sensor on the Mavic. So if we kind of look at the far trees there, these look sharp, and then these aren't as much. If I were to zoom in to say 300%, kind of get them to be about the same area. You can see it's much more apparent that on the aperture of 2.8, which is wide open, the original Mavic actually looks sharper from the distance to the near. So let's close in, zoom into the garage. So there the bricks look pretty good, and on the Mavic 2, the bricks look soft. So let's figure out why that is. So now we're looking at an image taken from my digital DSLR camera. So this is a 36 megapixel Nikon D800 camera. And what I did is I set it on a tripod. I focused on the chair post there right in the foreground, the white object. And with a wide open aperture of 2.8, you can see that the near is in focus and the far is soft or out of focus. That's called a shallow depth of field. Now I've increased my aperture to f4, and you can see that some of the background is a little bit more in focus, and it's still focused on the front foreground chair. Now this is f8, so I'm clamping down on the aperture, letting less light in, but I'm getting more and more in focus. Here's f16, you can see more of the background in focus, and finally f22. So pretty much everything is in focus from the near to the far. So this is representative of an image sensor size of a full-size sensor on a DSLR, which is 35 millimeters. What happens is when you have a small image sensor size, like a phone or like the original Mavic, that more is in focus from near to far. Once you increase your sensor size, then you start to get more shallow depth of field, like we saw in the Photoshop example. So now we're back in Photoshop, and we're on a second test where I'm comparing 4 images just from the Mavic 2 Pro. So with the Mavic 2 Pro, you have a variable aperture, so you can clamp down the iris on the camera. So if you make it smaller and smaller, it lets in less light. And how that is depicted on your settings is if the aperture is wide open, it's 2.8. So the next shot was f4, then f8, and f11. And in comparison to my DSLR test shots, we noticed that when the aperture was at its tightest or smallest opening, f22, we had more in focus from the near to the far. So let's see if that's the case with the Mavic 2. All right, so again, I'm going to take here, right now we're viewing it at 16% of the image. If I were to zoom it to 100%, and I'm going to match all of those to the same setting. So this is the 2.8, f4, f8, f11. So let's first look at the far and see how that looks. So way down here in the distance, it looks to be not as sharp. It's a little bit sharper here in f4. It's actually a little bit blurrier in f8 and blurry in f11. If we look at the street sign looks pretty sharp in both f2, f4. Definitely f4 is the sharper one. f8 it's getting a little bit fuzzy, and f11 it's getting even more fuzzy. So right off the bat, looking at what's the best aperture setting for doing aerial photography, I would say it's f4. That's where the lens aperture seems to be the sharpest to get your images. So now knowing that, let's take this and move it to the foreground of the bricks on the wall. So here, again, remember that I tapped the focus on the far, on the subject, on the distance down the road. So here, the bricks look to be about the same sharpness. I know it may be hard to see on your computer screen with a streaming video, but let's look at the blades of grass. Now, interesting enough, f2 seems to be fairly sharp. f4 is better. f8 is a little bit soft on the near focus, and f11 is softer yet on the near focus. So from this example, I deduced that the best setting for your Mavic 2 Pro is to have an aperture of f4 or f4.5. If you have it on f2.8 wide open aperture, then it's not going to be the best sharpness for that because you have a variable aperture and a larger image sensor size. Wow, are you still here? My brain hurts. That took a lot of information. Anyway, I hope it helped you. Leave comments if you have any questions about the video or the things I said. If I said anything incorrectly, please leave a comment below. So, thanks for watching. Happy flying.